Hello, my name is Ann Wright. I'm a retired U.S. Army colonel. I spent 29 years in the U.S. military, 13 on active duty and 16 in the reserves. And then I was a U.S. diplomat for 16 years and served in places like Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan. I helped open the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan in December of 2001. And then my last assignment was as the Deputy Ambassador in Mongolia. And it was there where in March of 2003, I ended up resigning from the diplomatic corps and from the U.S. government in opposition to the war in Iraq. Since then, I've been using my background and experience as a military officer and as a diplomat to explain why I continue to be against the war in Iraq, why I'm very concerned about what's going on in Afghanistan. And today I've just returned from Gaza, the second trip that I've been to in Gaza in the last month, where U.S. weaponry is being used by the Israeli Defense Forces in a huge attack, a 22-day attack on Gaza. All of these wars, though, are part of a dilemma that we all have in terms of how do people react to war and what are the wounds that people have. We know for sure about the physical wounds, but there are plenty of emotional and mental wounds that men and women in our military and civilians that are affected by war. All of these people, whether they're military or civilians, if they're in a war zone, they end up being dramatically affected by what goes on during war. A very violent action that's perpetrated by a state on another state for a political goal. And unfortunately, that political goal means that for tens of thousands, maybe millions of people, their emotional and mental health is dramatically affected. We know for so many people in our military, this thing called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, of men and women who've been in our military and have seen and done things in time of combat that they always will have emblazoned on their minds. And many of them regret what they saw or what they did. And it will take well, if they can recover from it, it'll probably take the rest of their life to recover from it. For men and women who have been civilians in a war zone, where they have seen their own homes destroyed, where they've seen their loved ones injured or killed, how they cope with these tremendous losses during time of violence, when they may be saying, I didn't do anything. How come people have gone after my family? How come they've broken down the doors to my house? How come they've killed or detained people in my family? And these sorts of memories that they will have for the rest of their lives will be an emotional drain on them that one would hope that psychological counseling can help alleviate it. But as we know from the history of most wars and military incursions, these types of emotional problems stay with people forever. So when we have conferences about how you heal from war, how you heal from military service, or how you heal from being a civilian in a war zone, I think the conferences are excellent because they do make us address the consequences of war. And I would hope that our policymakers would have to go through these conferences, the consequences of war, before they make a determination that our country does go to war. Because I think many times the politicians don't have any idea of the consequences of it. It's very easy for them to give orders to say, go to war, and not really be aware of what the real costs are of that war. I, as a military officer for 29 years, have served in several conflicts. I feel very fortunate that I myself, I don't think I'm suffering from post-traumatic stress. However, I would say that in working with other people who are really genuinely they have post-traumatic stress disorder, that those around them, the counselors, the people who try to advocate for them, over a period of time, they too develop a certain amount of stress. And I know in your communities there are people that work with the vet centers or work with family counseling centers, advocacy centers, who day after day after day hear the stories of the men and women who are struggling and trying to deal with the stresses of combat. And I think it takes its toll on those providers of counseling. So I would encourage everyone in the community to be very aware of what's going on in our community. The men and women who've come back into the community, having served in the National Guard and the reserves, or in an active duty unit, and have come back home after fulfilling their military assignments. And to be aware of what is happening in their families, where their wives or husbands or their children or their mothers and fathers are having to deal with and cope with a person who came back not the same person that left. That the being in these combat zones really does take its toll, and people don't come back the same. And then the families have to adjust to this new person who's come back to them. And it has a tremendous stress, and the statistics are pretty startling when you look at how many divorces there are in military families. That people are not able to readjust their lives to accommodate a person who may come back very angry, very upset, very anxious and nervous, and who can't really deal with having kids around so much anymore, or can't deal with the stresses maybe of going to college. There are some other stresses that occur in military families, though, or in the larger military family. And one of the stresses is how military people treat each other. I, as a woman in the military, am very concerned about the level of sexual assault and rape of women in the military. By the Veterans Administration statistics, it appears that 1 in 3 women in the military will be sexually assaulted or raped while she's in the military. And for an organization that prides itself on order and discipline, to have criminal acts being perpetrated on 1/3 of the women in the military is a pretty astounding thing. One would think that even though this is an organization that is based on violence, but it's supposed to be control violence, that people only kill others or shoot them or send artillery shells to kill other people only when ordered, and that violence is directed toward a specific enemy, and the enemy is not someone in your own ranks. And yet we find so many women soldiers who have been sexually assaulted and raped by their fellow soldiers. There's the phenomenon called command rape, where someone senior in the chain of command, the sergeant, says to a private, "If you don't do what I say, you could be dead tomorrow. It's a combat zone, so if you don't submit to my will." There are hundreds, thousands of cases like that we're finding out about now. Another issue is domestic violence within the family. On military bases, domestic violence is a very big problem, because the service member returning from a combat zone really does have difficulty controlling his anger or her anger. And the level of domestic violence on military bases and in civilian communities where military live is something that we all need to recognize as a cost of war, and try to provide the services that can help these men and women as they return to our communities. I think it's very important for us as citizens in a community to really look carefully at the returning military members into our communities. We need to be careful of men and women who return to law enforcement, where they will be required to do community law enforcement, and yet be coming straight from a military environment where the rules are very different on how you use your weapons